In this module, we're going to be talking about the units of personality. What are the important things that you would want to know in order to describe someone's personality or study their personality? To start, I want you to think of somebody you know well from school, a friend, a classmate, someone else like that. And now I want you to try to imagine that you're describing this person to somebody else, another friend, a relative like your mother. What would you say? What kinds of information would be important and interesting to convey what this person is like? Take a moment and think about it. When researchers have done this kind of exercise with people, they found that you get all different kinds of information. There are a lot of different things that you could say in order to describe somebody's personality. And regular people, when we ask them to describe someone's personality, say all different sorts of things. Sometimes people will start often with just adjectives, like saying this person's outgoing, or they're friendly, or they're smart. Sometimes we talk about somebody's background, where they grew up, what kinds of experiences they've had. Oh, my friend lived in another country for a while, or oh, my friend grew up in a small town. Sometimes people will talk about someone's goals and ambitions, what they're trying to accomplish in the big picture, or what they like to do in the shorter term. So my friend's studying to be a doctor, or my friend really likes to go party every weekend. There are all kinds of things that people say. And it turns out that just like ordinary people have to figure out what are they going to say when they're trying to describe someone's personality, personality psychologists have to deal with the same problem. So one of the founders of the field of personality psychology was a man named Gordon Allport. And Gordon Allport recognized that before personality psychologists could study important and interesting things about personality, they had to figure out what are the units that they were going to talk about. And personality psychologists over the years have proposed quite a few different kinds of answers. So one of these kinds of answers is personality traits, these short adjectives that we use to say what somebody's like in general. They're outgoing or they're friendly. But personality psychologists and other researchers have used all different other kinds of things. They've talked about beliefs about the self, expectations, goals. Freud was famous for studying unconscious conflicts. There are lots and lots of different things that you could use to describe somebody's personality. So in this module, I'm going to talk about one of the main ways that personality psychologists study personality, which is traits, as well as give you a little bit of information about some of the other ways. In other modules, we'll talk about actual research and findings that have come from studying traits and other units of personality. So to start with, what do we mean when we say a personality trait? Well, one general kind of definition, which comes from the textbook, is that a personality trait is a dispositional tendency to act in a certain way over time and across circumstances. A personality trait is what somebody's like in general, how they tend to think, feel, or act. And in the early days of personality psychology, lots and lots of different researchers were studying different personality traits. And it was very difficult for the field to accumulate evidence and to figure out when one researcher was talking, let's say, about extroversion and another researcher was talking about surgency. Were they talking about the same thing or different things? In fact, sometimes different researchers would actually use the same name for different things. So one researcher might say that they were studying extroversion, but they were studying how warm and friendly people were. Another researcher might say they're studying extroversion, and they're studying how assertive and dominant people are. And personality psychologists compared this problem to the classic story of the Tower of Babel, where people had lots and lots of different languages and they couldn't understand what each other were saying. So in the early days of personality psychology, one of the most important tasks for the field was to figure out a common framework for understanding personality traits. What are the most important personality traits and how are they related to each other? An important early step in this was identifying something that became known as the Lexical Hypothesis. This was really a motivating assumption that personality psychologists made in the early days about where they could find information about traits. And the idea was that human beings care a lot about other people. We're social animals. We're really interested in what other people are like. And it's really important for us to be able to think about and communicate about that. And so the lexical hypothesis was a proposal that the really important personality traits, the ones we need to care about a lot, are the ones that ordinary people care about a lot. And over long periods of time, cultures have encoded these into language as single words or short phrases. Things like outgoing or friendly. In the early days of personality psychology, Gordon Allport and a collaborator of his decided that they were going to take the lexical hypothesis and use that to try to create an organizing framework. So as a starting point, they sat down and they went through an Oxford English dictionary and tried to pick out all the words in the dictionary that could distinguish the behavior of one person from another. And in one important sense, this exercise really confirmed an important prediction of the lexical hypothesis, because Allport and Nodbear, his collaborator, identified 18,000 English language words that could be used to describe the behavior of one person from another. So it turns out that language really does contain a lot of information. Now, in order to reduce this complexity and figure out what are the really important words, Allport and Nodbear and other researchers working after them used a combination of methods. One of the things that they did was that they focused on the words that people use the most in everyday life. And they removed sort of archaic words that were in an unabridged dictionary or obvious synonyms, and they got a smaller set of words. And then what researchers did was a series of studies where they looked at how different words are correlated in people's usage. So to give you an example of that, think about the words kind and cooperative. Now, these are words that mean slightly different things. Kind has to do with caring for other people. Cooperative has to do with doing what other people want you to do. In principle, you might imagine that, well, maybe some people could be kind but not cooperative. They do nice things for others, but they don't really necessarily listen or try to coordinate their behavior, or the other way around. But it turns out that when you study people and you ask them, do you consider yourself kind and do you consider yourself cooperative, the people that say that they're kind or that say someone else is kind also say that that person is cooperative. Kind people tend to be cooperative, and unkind people tend to be uncooperative. And so we can use these kinds of statistical associations to identify patterns in the words that people use. And so this kind of association can be calculated as what's known as a correlation coefficient, where higher numbers mean that there's a stronger association between two things. And when researchers did these kinds of studies, what they found was that there were some pairs of words, like kind and cooperative, that were highly associated with each other. There might be another pair of words, like curious and artistic, that are highly associated with each other. But across these two different groups, the associations were quite low. So if you're kind, you're cooperative. If you're curious, you're artistic. But if you're kind, you may or may not be curious. It really has no strong association one way or the other. If you're cooperative, you may or may not be artistic. It really has no strong association one way or the other. So using these kinds of analyses and using a statistical technique called factor analysis, personality psychologists identified groups of traits that tended to go together. And through these analyses, a set of 5 groupings of traits emerged. The first person to identify this and to give a name to it was a psychologist named Lou Goldberg. Lou Goldberg is a retired professor from the University of Oregon. And he called this the Big Five because in these analyses, in analysis after analysis, they found 5 major groups or factors of traits that went together. So what are the Big Five? What are these 5 groupings? The Big Five, one way to remember what the Big Five are is to think of the word ocean, O-C-E-A-N. And each of these groupings starts with a different letter. So O stands for openness to experience. In this group of traits, we find things like intellect, imagination, curiosity, creativity. And if you try to think about someone who's very open to experience. One example of that from literature might be Alice in Wonderland, who goes through the rabbit hole and has lots of adventures with new people, and is very curious and interested and imaginative. The second of these big five traits is conscientiousness. Conscientiousness consists of more specific traits like order, duty, deliberation, self-discipline. This is kind of the Captain America factor. The third factor is extroversion. Extroversion consists of traits like sociability, assertiveness, activity, and positive emotions. If you are a fan of the TV show Gilmore Girls, Lorelai from the Gilmore Girls is the pinnacle of extroversion. Agreeableness consists of traits like trust, nurturance, kindness, cooperation, someone like Mr. Rogers, the classic children's TV character. And then finally, neuroticism, consisting of anxiety, depression, moodiness, vulnerability to stress. This is sort of like the Charlie Brown factor. Now, the Big Five is, at this current point in history, the main way that personality psychologists describe traits. So when we get into other modules and start talking about actual research, the Big Five is an important model. But it's important to note that it's not the only way that personality psychologists and others have tried to talk about traits. So to give you just a couple other examples, one of the earliest trait models was the Greek theory of humors. This was a theory that was developed by Hippocrates, the founder of the field of medicine, and his student Galen. Hippocrates and Galen believed that humors, or bodily fluids, contributed to different kinds of behavior, and that the balance of different fluids in the body would produce different personality types. Now, there's no evidence to support this idea that if you have more blood, you're a calm and friendly person, or that if you have more bile, you're more nasty. But the types that Hippocrates and Galen discovered have some interesting resemblances to the Big Five dimensions of extroversion and neuroticism. Another model that you may have heard of is the Myers-Briggs types. And in fact, it's possible that you've taken a Myers-Briggs test, especially if you've ever gone for career counseling, since it's a fairly popular test in personnel psychology. The Myers-Briggs types are based on the writings of Carl Jung, an early clinical psychologist who was a student of Sigmund Freud. The Myers-Briggs types, although they're somewhat useful, make a number of assumptions that aren't really supported by data. They assume that people are grouped into discrete categories, whereas the Big Five assumes that traits are on a continuum, and the data supports the continuum a little bit better. And there are some other aspects of the Myers-Briggs that make it less than ideal. So nowadays, psychologists are more and more using the Big Five. Now, even though traits are an important and useful approach to studying personality, the trait approach does have a number of limitations. Traits are relatively quick to measure. You can find out your Big Five profile in about 5 minutes by taking a self-report questionnaire, but they don't go very deep. They don't tell us a lot about the deep workings of someone's psyche. Traits do a pretty good job of predicting broad patterns of behavior, how someone generally tends to act, but they're not particularly good at predicting single instances of behavior. If I want to know whether someone generally tends to show up late to meetings, then knowing their level of conscientiousness helps. But if I want to know whether they're going to be on time to the final exam next Thursday, then their personality is probably not a very good predictor. Behavior can vary by situations, and traits do not describe specific situations, and so some researchers have argued that they're limited this way. They give us how you generally tend to act, but if you're consistently different across situations, they don't really tell us about that. So some of the other units that personality psychologists have studied try to overcome some of these limitations in various ways. One very influential approach developed by a personality psychologist named Walter Mischel is something called Ifthen Profiles. The idea of an if-then profile is that instead of describing what your personality is like in general, we might try to describe what your personality is like in different specific situations. So imagine we're going to be studying Elaine and Iris. Rather than saying how extroverted is Elaine and how extroverted is Iris, we might say, well, how extroverted is Elaine with her family, with her friends, and in class? So we would look at 3 different situations. And what we might find is that Elaine is not very extroverted with her family. She's somewhat extroverted when she's hanging out with her friends, but when she's in a classroom, she's very outgoing and talkative. Iris, on the other hand, might be not very extroverted with her family, not very extroverted with her friends, and especially introverted in the classroom. And so the idea is that by studying Ifthen profiles, we might get a more nuanced view of personality at the expense of having a more complex model. Another kind of unit that psychologists study is motives and goals. The idea being that instead of just studying what a person typically does, which is their traits, we might focus on what a person is typically trying to do, goals and motives. And there are a few different ways of describing motives and goals. Some researchers have focused on what they call the big 3, broad motives associated with approaching power, approaching affiliation, and approaching achievement. So are you generally interested in gaining power? Are you generally interested in affiliating and being close to others? Are you generally interested in trying to get ahead in school and work? In addition, some researchers have focused on narrower goals at work, in relationships, etc. Another way that personality psychologists have studied personality is by studying the narratives that people tell. Here the idea is that your personality consists of the stories you tell about yourself and perhaps that others tell about you. So a narrative approach to personality, we would be interested in part in the specifics of your story. If we asked you to tell us about your life story, we would be interested in knowing, well, what did you say happened? But another really important part of a narrative understanding of personality is how people tell their stories. So to give you an example of this, some people will tell their story in such a way that episodes always end with a positive outcome, with everything looking for the better. Even when something really horrible happens, they'll end the story by talking about how things got better or what they learned. Other people consistently tell their stories about good things turning bad. So they'll tell you about the most positive events in their life, but then they'll end the story with telling you how it all got ruined in the end. And the idea is that by studying people's narratives, we might learn something about their personality. And we don't just take the narratives at face value, we use them as a lens to understand how somebody sees themselves and the world. Now, in thinking about these different approaches to the units of personality, one influential psychologist has been Dan McAdams. Dan McAdams has been an advocate of looking at different kinds of units, not just one, and focusing on what different units do best. So at the first level, McAdams says, when we first want to get an initial understanding of somebody, we focus on traits. McAdams has called traits the psychology of the stranger. If you know nothing else about somebody, the first thing you're going to figure out is, are they outgoing or not? Are they friendly or not? This is something that we learn about someone. It doesn't really tell us anything about context, but it tells us what they're like in general. As we get to know somebody better, we start focusing on personal concerns, attributes that depend on time and place and role. So things like their goals, their values, and their beliefs. And then for McAdams, the deepest level is identity. And that's really where narratives and life stories come into play. Who am I? What am I trying to do in my life? Identity for McAdams is an evolving life story and something that tells us about the deepest levels of personality.